Imagine this scene. The great walls, once the pride of an empire, now collapsing in flames. The clanging of swords, the sound of shouts. A mighty dynasty coming to an end. And then the question pops into your mind, what caused this collapse? A foreign invasion? A lost battle? A treasonous plot? Usually these are the questions that come to mind. But what if the answer were much simpler and more terrifying? What if the greatest enemy of an empire did not come from outside, but was nurtured within its own heart, in the most lavish rooms of the Forbidden City? Chinese history has proven a cruel truth. The thing that can destroy a dynasty faster than war is the bottomless lust of a man, the most powerful man in the world. But the story is not simply about lustful kings. It is more complicated than that, because the greatest sins in history are often covered up by the most perfect excuses. And this is the play that has been performed for thousands of years. The tragedy of an entire nation, cleverly hidden under the shadow of a sacred concept called imperial duty. To understand how emperors could openly possess thousands, even tens of thousands of women without being considered promiscuous, we must strip away our modern lens and look at the problem like an ancient strategist. For them, the harem was not a pleasure, but a tool for national security. The foundation of this argument is frighteningly solid. A dynasty, no matter how strong, can collapse overnight if there is no successor. History has seen too many bloody civil wars, brothers killing each other, and countries falling into chaos just because the throne was vacant or there was endless conflict. So what is the solution? That is to ensure that the supply of dragon babies is always abundant. And to do that, the emperor must have many concubines. The more women, the higher the probability of giving birth to a prince. The more princes, the more options to find the most talented and virtuous successor, while creating a solid reserve. According to this logic, the emperor's body is no longer his own. It is the property of the nation, a tool to preserve the bloodline of the dynasty. Each night of grace is not a pleasure, but a time to perform a duty. The selection of beauties from all over the country is not to satisfy desire, but to gather the best genes, the healthiest potential mothers for the future generation of the royal family. This was a brilliant excuse. It transformed carnal passion into political responsibility. It clothed personal desire in the noble cloak of patriotism and concern for the country. Any official who dared to criticize the emperor's extravagant lifestyle could be branded as short-sighted, blind to the big picture, unconcerned about the safety of the dynasty. You only see His Majesty enjoying himself with his beautiful wife, a trusted eunuch might say, but don't you see his anxiety about a future without an heir? The play was so perfect that it rationalized itself. It allowed power to be indulged without limit, while still maintaining the appearance of legitimacy and responsibility. And so, a huge system was born from this obligation. Selections were held in a grand manner every 3 years. Thousands of young women had to leave their families and enter a fierce competition whose reward was to become part of the royal collection. Rules and ranks were set in detail to manage this resource. Everything was systematized, routined, all in the name of the stability of the empire. But is that really the end goal? Can a system born of reason and responsibility retain its purity when placed in the hands of a flesh and blood human being, with all his desires and weaknesses? What happens when duty becomes a pretext, a thin veil covering a stage where desire is the real director? This perfect play has a fatal flaw. It was designed for a god, but its operator is a human. And when a machine designed to serve the nation begins to operate only to serve the desires of one man, that is when the foundations of a dynasty begin to crack, silently but irreparably. Before we meet the kings who accelerated this process, we need to dissect the machine itself. To understand how a noble duty can be corrupted from within, we must do something few people do. Look not at the operator, but at the design of the machine itself. The ruthless and efficient machine is called the harem. It is not built of steel and gears, but of women's flesh and blood, of cold rules and soulless numbers. Its exterior is silk and brocade, but at its core it is a production line, where love is discarded and people are turned into objects. The input to this machine was a national process, a human harvest on a grand scale. Every 3 years, edicts from the Forbidden City would be sent out to all the provinces of the empire. The orders were not to find talents or to collect taxes, but to find raw material for the harem, young women between the ages of 14 and 16. This was not an invitation, but an order. Thousands of families, from officials to commoners, were required to present their daughters. For many, it was an honor, a chance to ascend to the clouds. But for the young girls, it was the day they would forever say goodbye to their families, their friends, and their identities. The selection was a brutal beauty contest with many rounds of elimination. In the first round, experienced eunuchs and midwives would eliminate thousands of candidates based on their gait, voice, or the slightest blemish on their skin. Those who passed would be scrutinized more closely for their facial features, body measurements, and health. But beauty was only part of the equation. Family background, education, and virtue were also considered. The machine needed more than just a pretty face. It needed a product that was perfect inside and out. In the end, only a very small portion, the best of the best, were chosen to walk through the palace gates. They entered with hope, unaware that they had just become part of a vast collection. From that moment on, their names were less important than the titles they would be bestowed with. Once inside, the raw materials are put into the processing chain. This is when their individuality and identity are eroded and replaced by rank. Book Zhou Li, an ancient manual on management, outlined an ideal structure for this machine. A perfect pyramid structure. At the top is one empress, below are 3 noble consorts, then 9 Qin, 27 Shifu, and finally 81 imperial wives. A total of 121 people, a number that was considered reasonable and manageable. A system designed to ensure harmony, order, and efficiency. But theory is gray, and the tree of life is evergreen. As dynasties grew stronger and richer, emperors began to break down the structure. The number 121 quickly became a joke. During the Han Dynasty, the harem numbered several thousand. By the Tang Dynasty, under Emperor Xuanzong, the recorded number had reached an unimaginable 40,000. Imagine 40,000 women living crammed into the walls. The harem was no longer a family. It was a miniature city with unspoken rules, struggles for survival, and a competition where the only reward was a glance from the emperor. The machine was overloaded. It became unwieldy, irrational, and its original purpose, to secure the bloodline, was eclipsed by its own enormity. And finally, we come to the output of the machine, its core operating logic, the 15-night rotation calendar. This was a detailed plan, calculated according to the cycles of the moon, for the systematic distribution of the emperor's favors. For 15 nights, the emperor was scheduled to sleep with concubines from highest to lowest in rank. In theory, it ensured that everyone, from the empress to the lowest-ranking concubines, had their chance. It turned the bedroom into an administrative process, a job that had to be done on a schedule. Emotions, romance, and personal choice were all eliminated. It was the height of dehumanization, where the most intimate human behavior was planned like a council meeting. But then again, reality was cruel. With a harem of thousands and tens of thousands of women, the 15-night rotation system became a cruel promise. If an emperor slept with a different woman every night, it would take him decades to complete the cycle. Many women entered the palace in their prime, and by the time their hair turned gray, they had never once seen the face of a dragon. They were cogs in a giant machine, brought in, sorted, and then left to rust in a corner of a splendid warehouse. The harem machine, which was created for a good reason, has turned itself into a monster. It consumes the youth of tens of thousands of women, turning them into soulless numbers and creating a living environment filled with despair. But this monster can become even more bizarre. What happens when the master of the machine, the emperor, finds its mechanical rules too annoying? What happens when he decides to throw away logic and schedule and replace them with something more pure and random? That is when the machine not only breaks down, but becomes ridiculous. And that is the story of a king who decides that the fate of his concubines and his own duty is best decided by a goat. And the emperor who made this absurdity a reality, who officially abandoned logic in favor of randomness, was Sima Yin, the founder of the Jin dynasty. The irony is that Sima Yin was not an incompetent man. On the contrary, he was a brilliant military and political strategist who ended the decades-long chaos of the Three Kingdoms and unified China. He was a man of foresight on the battlefield and on the political chessboard. But it seems that, having reached the pinnacle of his power when there were no more opponents to conquer, he began a new conquest, the conquest of the world of desire. And he did it on the scale of a military campaign. After destroying his last rival, Eastern Wu, Sima Yin did more than annex their territory. He ordered the confiscation of the entire harem of the Eastern Wu emperor. Thousands more women were sent to Luoyang, swelling his harem machine to an unprecedented level in history. Historians put the number at over 10,000. The machine was not only overloaded, it collapsed under its own weight. With such a city of women, the 15-night rotation system became a useless plan. Even remembering their names or recognizing their faces was impossible. The emperor faced a problem that no previous emperor had encountered on this scale: how to choose 1 out of 10,000 for a night of favor. And his solution, which has gone down in history as one of the strangest anecdotes, was the Yang Xe, the goat cart. Sima Yin had a small cart built, pulled by a few goats. Every night, after a heavy banquet, he would get into this cart and let the goats roam freely. They did not follow any particular route. They turned left, turned right, went straight, or stopped completely depending on the animal's instinct. The cart wandered through the endless corridors of the harem, where thousands of identical rooms lay silent in the dark. And the rules of the game were simple. The door of whichever room the goat cart stopped at, the owner of that room would be the emperor's favorite for the night. Stop and imagine the scene. Night falls, and the forbidden city falls silent. But for the 10,000 women, that is when the torture of hope begins. In their private rooms, they dress in their finest clothes, adorn themselves with their finest makeup, and listen. They hear not the emperor's footsteps, but the clatter of cart wheels, and, if they are lucky, the faint sound of goat bells in the distance. That sound is the music of fate. It draws near, stirring their hearts with fervent hope. Then it slowly recedes, leaving them with crushing disappointment. Night after night, year after year, their lives, their families' futures, are all staked on a lottery controlled by an animal. Sima Yin's action was not just a lazy solution. It was a powerful symbol of how absolute power had corroded his mind. First, it was a symbol of indifference. He did not care. To him, those 10,000 women were no different. They were not individuals with their own stories and personalities, but just a nameless crowd. Choosing one of them was like picking a pebble from a giant pebble field. The choice was left to the goat, because to him, it had no weight. Second, it is a symbol of decadence. Sex, which was originally a sacred duty, as it was originally claimed, has now become a burden. It is so troublesome that the emperor does not even bother to think about it. He has automated his desires. This is the pinnacle of hedonism, when pleasure is so great that it becomes a chore that needs to be decided for him by someone else or something else. However, in a system driven by randomness, humans always find ways to gain an advantage. The clever palace maids quickly discovered the weakness of the lottery. They knew that goats like to eat bamboo leaves and like the taste of salt, so a secret race began. They found ways to plant small bamboo clumps in front of their rooms or sprinkle salt water on the ground. They made themselves active players in the emperor's game of chance. They could not control the emperor, but they could seduce the goat. It was an act that was both clever and tragic. It showed the hunger for attention and the desperation of the women trapped in that emotionless machine. The story of Sima Yan's goat cart reveals one kind of depravity, a passive, lazy, and indifferent depravity. He was so immersed in a sea of desire that he had no strength left to swim, but simply drifted aimlessly. But history records another kind of depravity, a more terrifying kind. It is not indifference, but initiative. It is not laziness, but extraordinary effort. It is when an emperor does not regard pleasure as a burden, but sees it as a mountain to be conquered. A king does not wait for the goat to choose for him, but actively seeks it out, hunts it, and is willing to trade his life to reach the pinnacle of enjoyment. If Sima Yin was the image of a man so full that he was lazy, a man immersed in an ocean of pleasure and let the waves carry him, then history has shown us the complete opposite, a man so hungry that he was insane, a man who kept swimming upstream, trying to drink up the entire ocean. That man was Emperor Cheng of Han, Liu Ao. His tragedy did not lie in his indifference, but in his effort. He did not die of giving up, but of trying too hard in his meaningless conquest, conquering the limits of desire. Liu Ao ascended to the throne in circumstances that any king would envy. The Western Han dynasty was in a relatively stable period at that time, inheriting the legacy of talented kings who came before it, especially his great-grandfather, Emperor Xian of Han, one of the dynasty's best emperors. The country had no major foreign invasions, and there was no serious internal turmoil. The path was paved for Liu Ao to become a wise king, continuing to bring the dynasty to new heights. But he chose a different path. Instead of looking outside the walls of the city, he chose to venture inward, into the deep corridors of the harem and the limits of his own body. At first, everything seemed normal. He also had a harem with Empress Su and concubine Ban, a famous concubine, who were his favorites. But this stability did not last. Liu Ao was by nature a seeker of novelty, someone who easily grew tired of what had become familiar. And then, fate brought him into contact with two sisters who would change his life and contribute to the downfall of an entire dynasty, Zhao Fian and Zhao Heda. Their beauty and seductive skills completely captivated Liu Ao. He quickly deposed the empress, shunned his other concubines, and devoted all his attention, power, and national wealth to these two women. But the story is not just about a king infatuated with a beauty. For Liu Ao, it is a quest. He does not just want to enjoy pleasure, he wants to conquer pleasure. He sees his body as a battlefield and believes that he can overcome all natural limits. His tools in this battle are miracle drugs, pills that are said to have the ability to increase vitality to extraordinary levels. He takes them regularly, believing that they will help him achieve a kind of immortality in the world of pleasure. The entire Han court became a stage for this frenzied search. Banquets lasted day after day and night. State affairs were completely neglected. While the ministers worried about the state of the country, the emperor was busy with his conquest. Records and anecdotes say that thanks to these pills, he could visit many palaces in the same night, maintaining a debauched lifestyle that ordinary people could not imagine. He was like an addict, always needing a higher dose to achieve the same sublime feeling as the first time. The pleasure was no longer a joy. It had become an obsession, a monster that needed to be fed every day, and its food was the emperor's vitality and the stability of the empire. And then, what had to happen happened. The battle against the limits of nature always has only one loser. One morning, Emperor Cheng of Han was found dead in his bed, right after a night he was said to have spent with his younger sister Zhao Heda. His death was sudden and mysterious, causing a shock in the royal family. The Empress Dowager ordered a thorough investigation. The final result, although not widely publicized but recorded by later historians, indicated that the cause of death was an overdose of aphrodisiacs. It was an ironic ending. The emperor spent his life searching for immortality and pleasure, only to be killed by his own search engine. He wanted to prove that he could surpass the limits of a mortal, but in the end he died the most mundane death. His luxurious bed became his final battlefield, and he failed miserably. Liu Ao's death from his bed was not only a personal tragedy, it was a warning about the dangers of pursuing desires to the extreme. We have seen two extremes of depravity. A Sima Yin so indifferent that he entrusted his fate to a goat, and a Liu Ao so fanatical that he burned himself in the fire of his own desires. One was passive, the other was active, but the end result was still corruption. But in the stories of one's indifference and the other's madness, we seem to have forgotten a main character, a silent character, but the most numerous, tens of thousands of women. They were items in Sima Yan's collection, tools in Liu Ao's conquest. So what were their lives really like behind those doors? Behind the stories of the emperors, what voices were silenced? We have spent time talking about the men of power, about the laziness of one and the madness of another. We have analyzed the machine and the men who ran it. But to fully understand the scale of the tragedy, we must do something that emperors themselves rarely do. Turn the lens, point it away from the throne and into the countless hidden corners of the harem, where thousands of lives wither in silence. It is time to listen to the echoes from the gilded cage. For a young girl newly recruited to the palace, the first days must have been a dream. She was surrounded by unimaginable luxury. The most precious silks, gold and jade jewelry, foods that commoners would never taste in their entire lives. She was taught that this was the ultimate honor, that she had been chosen to serve the Son of Heaven, and that her future and that of her family would be glorious. But the dream was shattered very quickly. Reality came crashing down cruelly. She realized that she was not alone. She was just one among thousands, a drop in the vast ocean. The emperor she longed for day and night was only a distant figure, a legend told through the mouths of eunuchs. Her life, and that of thousands of others, was defined by a paradox, imprisoned in splendor. The palace was a gilded cage where everything was beautiful, but there was no freedom. And in that cage, the only currency of value was the emperor's attention. A look, a compliment, a night of favor could change everything. It could elevate a person from lowly status to a respected concubine, bringing glory to the entire family. But the supply of this currency was extremely scarce, while the demand was almost limitless. This created a fierce competition, a zero-sum game, where the success of one meant the failure of thousands. This competition is not just ordinary jealousy. It is a battle for survival. Each person must choose a strategy for themselves. Some choose the path of virtue, trying to cultivate the zither, chess, poetry, and painting in the hope that their talents will reach the emperor, like Han Qingdi's concubine band. Others choose the path of cunning, trying to make friends with powerful eunuchs, bribing them to speak well of them in front of the emperor, or spreading false rumors to bring down their opponents. And there are those who, in desperation, think of unimaginable ways like Sima Yan's seduction of goats. All of these efforts, whether noble or base, stem from a single desire, to be seen. But for the vast majority, their only strategy is to wait. Waiting is the definition of their lives. Their days begin with dressing up and putting on makeup, as if today were the day of destiny. And then they sit in their palace rooms, waiting for an audience that will never come. They watch spring pass, then summer, then fall, then winter. They watch their youth fade away like the petals in the forbidden courtyard, unappreciated, uncared for. Tang Dynasty poets left countless lamenting verses about this pain. One poem is about a palace maid sitting and watching the stars of the cowherd and the weaver girl on the Qixi festival night, feeling sorry for her fate that she cannot even meet once a year. Another poem describes a beautiful woman with silver hair, still sitting and recounting stories about the reign of Emperor Xuanzong of Tang, a glorious time that she could only watch from afar. Their pain is not a great tragedy, but a slow death, an erosion of hope over thousands of hopeless days. The fate of these forgotten men often ended in silence. They would grow old and die in a corner of the palace, their names erased from history. The lucky few, after the emperor's death, would be taken to the mausoleum to live out the rest of their lives as tomb guards, burying their youth with a man they barely knew. What about the truly lucky ones, those who won the emperor's heart? Were their lives any better? History has given us a tragic answer through the story of Yang Guifei. She was the one who received it all, the absolute love of Emperor Xuanzong of Tang, his boundless favor. The emperor ignored the harem of 3,000 beauties to love her alone. But that ultimate favor turned her and her family into targets of political hatred. When the Lushan rebellion broke out, soldiers mutinied, demanding that the emperor execute Yang Guifei, believing that she was the source of all the disasters. And Emperor Xuanzong of Tang, The most powerful emperor had to helplessly watch as his most beloved was strangled to death. Winning the harem game ultimately led to a tragic death. This proved that in this system, there were no real winners. The golden cage is a machine that crushes youth, hope, and humanity. The pain, jealousy, intrigue, and tragedy of tens of thousands of women are not just personal stories. They are symptoms of a system that is sick to the core. When a system is so rotten that it creates countless tragedies, what happens when its leader is not only indifferent like Sima Yin or personally depraved like Liu Ao, but also actively abetting the corruption, even encouraging and enjoying it? That is when the symptoms turn into cancer and the dynasty begins to count down to its end. The answer to that question lies in one of the darkest periods of the Han Dynasty, during the reign of Emperor Huan of Han Luji. If previous emperors had overtaxed the harem machine and turned it into a game, Liu Ji did something worse. He completely destroyed the controls and handed them over to saboteurs. He was not just a product of the rotten system. He was the boiling point of the corruption, the moment when the latent disease of the dynasty erupted into an incurable malignancy. He was the clearest example of how an emperor could become the greatest enemy of his own dynasty. Liu Ji ascended to the throne in a time when the Eastern Han Dynasty was in decline. The power of the imperial clans and the rise of the eunuchs had long been a source of trouble. But instead of trying to restore order, Liu Ji chose the easiest path. He realized that ruling a country was a hassle. It required listening to harsh advice, making difficult decisions, and facing bad news about natural disasters and enemy attacks. And he found the perfect solution to avoid all of that: handing over all power to the eunuchs. It was a devilish bargain. In return, the eunuchs would build him a perfect world. They would praise him as a wise king, report only the best of the best, and most importantly, they would satisfy all his needs for pleasure. All Liu Ji had to do was sign their edicts and enjoy a life of luxury. And he did. The Han court was no longer run from the throne, but from the dark chambers of the eunuchs. They held the power to appoint officials, control the army, and manage the national treasury. Meanwhile, those with real talent and loyalty faced a tragic end. Any official who dared to criticize the eunuch's abuses or the emperor's lifestyle was considered an enemy. They were falsely accused, dismissed from office, imprisoned, or forced to commit suicide. History calls this period the Cold War of the Party, when upright scholars, and officials sought to unite against the eunuchs, but were brutally suppressed. The Han bureaucracy was purged, leaving only flatterers, greedy, and incompetent people. The moral and intellectual foundations of the empire were completely destroyed. So while the eunuchs were trying to undermine the country, what was Emperor Huan of Han doing? He was busy building his own fairyland within the palace walls. His obsession was not limited to women, but also extreme luxury. He built magnificent palaces, exotic gardens with rare birds and animals imported from all over. His harem was also expanded to enormous proportions, with thousands of concubines living in excess, while the people outside were starving. Liu Ji's indulgence was different from that of his predecessors. It was no longer a mere personal indulgence, but an act of denial of reality. The endless feasts, the all-night revelries were not merely for entertainment. They were a wall of sound and light that the emperor erected so that he would not hear the groans of his people, would not see the truth that his empire was rotting. He lived in a fantasy world created by his eunuchs, a world where he was still a great king, and everything was fine. Liu Ji's actions were the spark that brought the simmering pot of the Han Dynasty to a boiling point. The corruption was no longer secret. It was open and systematic. Official positions were openly bought and sold. Incompetent but wealthy men could easily buy a county magistrate's post, then exploit the people to recoup their losses and make a profit. The national treasury was drained to fund the emperor's lavish projects and enrich the eunuch clique. To compensate, heavy taxes were imposed on the already poor peasants. Injustice and oppression reached their peak, and when the people's tolerance was exceeded, rebellions began to break out. There were small-scale uprisings at first, but they were the first bubbles that signaled that the pot was about to overflow. Emperor Huan, by completely abdicating his responsibilities in abetting corruption, transformed himself from a king into a destroyer. He became the most dangerous enemy because he destroyed the empire from its very core. When Liu Ji died, he left behind a terrible legacy. The Han dynasty had become a hollow shell. The central court had lost all power and prestige. The economy was in ruins. The people were resentful. He did not end the dynasty, but he created all the conditions necessary for its collapse. He loaded the gun, cocked it, and put his finger on the trigger. His successors would only need to squeeze his hand to bring the dynasty to ruin. When an empire was so rotten to the core, how did its eventual collapse come about? How did palace feasts directly trigger wars on the frontier? It was a domino effect, an inevitable chain reaction that we will explore. An empire does not fall overnight. It dies slowly, like a poisoned body, and the depravity in the emperor's bedchamber is the initial poison injected into the bloodstream. The chain reaction of dominoes that it causes, once started, is unstoppable. Now, together, we will follow those dominoes, watching them fall one after another, coldly and ruthlessly, starting with personal desire and ending in a brutal war. The first domino, decadence in the bedroom. This is the starting point. It all begins when an emperor, like Emperor Huan of Han or his successor Emperor Ling of Han, decides that personal pleasure is more important than the responsibilities of ruling the country. To get that pleasure, he needs two things: lots of money to spend on palaces, banquets, and a huge harem, and freedom from the pesky advice of upright officials. The pushing of one domino creates a need, and that need triggers the next domino. The second domino, corruption, becomes state policy. In order to have money and freedom, the emperor gave power to the only people who could guarantee him both: greedy eunuchs and their sycophants. They immediately turned the entire state apparatus into a money-making machine. During the reign of Emperor Ling of Han, this corruption reached its peak. They not only imposed new and unreasonable taxes, but also openly opened an office in the palace to sell titles. The position of prefect of a district had its price. The position of county magistrate had its price. Whoever paid the highest price would get the position. Ability, morality, and experience all became meaningless. Money became the only standard. The government no longer existed to rule, but to extort. The third domino, local extortion. The second domino fell, pushing the third. Those who had spent a fortune on official positions now had to find a way to recoup their investment and make a profit. When they were appointed to local posts, they ruled like packs of hungry wolves released into a flock of sheep. They raised taxes, invented fees, seized land from peasants, and took everything they could. The links from the central to the local were now painfully clear. A new garden built for the emperor in the capital meant the loss of land for hundreds of families in a remote countryside. A lavish banquet in the palace could starve an entire village. The lust of one man at the top translated directly into the misery of millions at the bottom. The fourth domino, the people's desperation and resentment. The third domino fell, crushing the innocent people, oppressed by greedy officials. The peasants also had to face constant natural disasters, such as floods and droughts. But the court, already corrupt and incompetent, had no effective relief policies. The people were pushed to the limit. They lost their land, had to leave their homeland, became vagrants, had to sell their wives and children, and many died of hunger on the roadside. This desperation eroded the last thing that tied them to the dynasty: the mandate of heaven. They no longer believed that the king above was the son of heaven, worthy to rule them. When the ruler could not bring life to the people, they lost their legitimacy. The suffering turned into resentment, and resentment was just waiting for a spark. The fifth domino, the flame of rebellion. And that spark was lit. The anger of the masses found a leader and an ideology in the Yellow Turban Rebellion led by the three Zhangju brothers. This was no small rebellion, but a true revolutionary storm, spreading throughout the empire and shaking the Han dynasty to its very foundations. They had a powerful slogan aimed squarely at the legitimacy of the court: The blue heaven is dead. The yellow heaven shall be established. The blue heaven was the symbol of the Han dynasty. It was a declaration of war, a declaration that the dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven and that a new dynasty, the yellow heaven, would replace it. The fire spread rapidly because it was fueled by millions of desperate people. And here comes the final irony of history. The Han court, already weakened by corruption and incompetence, was powerless to quell this massive uprising. To save itself, it was forced to commit a suicidal act, allowing local generals and nobles to recruit their own troops to fight the Yellow Turbans. This was the final domino. To quell the fallout from their own actions, the imperial court had to give up its last and most important power, control of the military. Warlords such as Cao Cao, Liu Bei, Sun Quan, and Dong Zhuo took this opportunity to build up their own forces. After defeating the Yellow Turbans, they not only did not return power, but also realized that the central court was only a shadow. They began to attack each other and manipulate the puppet emperor, ushering in the bloody period of the Three Kingdoms. The dominoes have fallen. The path from the emperor's bedchamber to the battlefield is clear. Individuelle corruption fuel systémique corruption. Systemic corruption leads to exploitation. Exploitation breeds popular resentment, and that resentment fuels the uprising that sinks an entire dynasty. What lessons can we learn from this chain of collapse? Why do these ancient stories still haunt and resonate with us today? It is because they contain a timeless example. So when we look into the mirror of history, what do we see? Are we just seeing stories of ancient Chinese emperors, goat carts, and aphrodisiacs? Or do we see familiar patterns, timeless lessons about human nature and power that are just as relevant today? The answer is, these stories are not about the past. They are about us. The first and most fundamental lesson this mirror reflects is that power is a poison that corrodes the mind. The downfall of emperors comes not from innate evil, but from the absence of limits. Absolute power insulates them from reality. It removes the consequences of their actions. Sima Yin could choose his wife with indifference because no one dared to say he was lazy. Liu Ao could destroy his own body because no one dared to interrupt the sun of heaven's pleasures. Emperor Huan of Han could entrust the entire country to his eunuchs because no one had the courage to criticize him. Lust is only a symptom. The real disease is the arrogance born of unchecked power, an arrogance that makes people believe they are above the law. If power is poison, then responsibility is the only antidote. It is the anchor that keeps the ship of power from being swept away by the storms of hubris. The moment these emperors saw the throne as a privilege to be enjoyed rather than a duty to be borne, they severed that anchor. The mandate of heaven is not a blank sheet of paper that allows them to do whatever they want. It is a contract. The people pay taxes and obey, and in return, the emperor must ensure their peace and prosperity. When the emperor violates his part of the contract, it becomes void. This is where the royal duty, excused from the beginning, is exposed. It is just an excuse because they have forgotten what their real duty is. The third lesson is about the temptation of shortcuts. Why did Liu Ji empower eunuchs? Because it was easier than facing the complex problems of the country. Why did Sima Yin use a goat cart? Because it was easier than having to think and choose. Shortcuts always seem attractive. It is easier to surround yourself with flatterers than to listen to constructive criticism. It is easier to blame circumstances than to take responsibility. The history of these emperors shows an undeniable truth. Every shortcut in governance eventually leads to the abyss. And don't think these lessons are just for ancient emperors. The mirror of history is still shining on our modern world. Today's emperor could be a head of state, a CEO of a giant corporation, or anyone with great power who can influence the lives of others. A harem doesn't have to be a place full of women. It can be a collection of supercars, a lavish mansion, an extravagant lifestyle completely cut off from the reality of employees or citizens. It can also be a mental harem, a circle of yes men, a media that paints reality in rosy tones, creating a fantasy world for the leader. Today's eunuchs are opportunists who whisper into the ears of their leaders what they want to hear for their own gain. Selling official titles still exists in more subtle forms, where policies are created to serve the interests that have invested in the leader instead of serving the common good. And the domino effect is still happening every day. A wrong decision made in a luxurious boardroom can put thousands of people out of work. A policy enacted for personal gain can destroy the living environment of an entire community. Corruption at the top always creates misery at the bottom. Finally, as we look into this mirror, we must not forget the echoes from the Gilded Cage. In every story of the fall of corrupt power, the heaviest price is always paid by the innocent and the weak. It is the women whose youth was buried in the palace. It is the peasants who lost everything because of high taxes. It is the loyal officials who paid with their lives for daring to speak the truth. They are the forgotten victims of selfish desires. These stories are not mere anecdotes for entertainment. They are case studies in failure, early warning systems handed down by history. They show that no matter how great an empire, how strong its walls, how powerful its army, when built on a foundation of irresponsibility and selfishness, collapse is inevitable. The mirror of history is clear and cruel. The only question is whether we have the courage to look at it. And so our journey through the corridors of power and desire in Chinese history comes to a close. From the arbitrary goat carts to the self-destructive drugs, from the indifference of the rulers to the pain of the ruled, these stories are both shocking and thought-provoking. They remind us that history is not a dry series of events, but a living drama of human nature, with all its triumphs and tragedies. While many of its details may have been mythologized over the centuries, its core message remains, echoing through time. It is a warning about the fragility of power and the weight of responsibility. The greatest dynasties do not simply fall by the sword of their enemies, but often rot from within by the complacency and corruption of their leaders. Hopefully, by looking back at the mistakes of the past, we can learn something for the present. Because in the end, history is not just about telling what happened. It is about understanding why it happened, and most importantly, making sure we don't make the same mistakes again. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that even in the most scandalous stories, there are always valuable lessons waiting to be discovered.